हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो आज हम देखने वाले हैं एनसीईआरटी हिस्ट्री क्लास 10, जिसमें आज हम देखेंगे सेक्शन 3 एवरीडे लाइफ, कल्चर एंड पॉलिटिक्स। तो उसका है ये चैप्टर 7, जो कि है प्रिंट कल्चर एंड द मॉडर्न वर्ल्ड। तो शुरू करते हैं हमारा आज का चैप्टर। It is difficult for us to imagine a world without printed matter. We find evidence of print everywhere around us, in books, journals, newspapers, prints of famous paintings, and also in everyday things like theater programs, official circulars, calendars, diaries, advertisements, cinema posters at street corners. We read printed literature, see printed images, follow the news through newspapers, and track public debates that appear in print. We take for granted this world of print and often forget that there was a time before print. We may not realize that print has a history which has in fact shaped our contemporary world. What is this history? When did printed literature begin to circulate? How has it helped create the modern world? In this chapter, we will look at the development of print from its beginnings in East Asia to its expansion in Europe and in India. We will understand the impact of the spread of technology and consider how social lives and cultures changed with the coming of print. The first printed books. The earliest kind of print technology was developed in China, Japan, and Korea. This was a system of hand printing. From AD 594 onwards, books in China were printed by rubbing paper, also invented there, against the inked surface of wood blocks. As both sides of the thin porous sheet could not be printed, the traditional Chinese accordion book was folded and stitched at the side. Superbly skilled craftsmen could duplicate with remarkable accuracy the beauty of calligraphy. Calligraphy, the art of beautiful and stylish writing. The imperial state in China was for a very long time the major producer of printed material. China possessed a huge bureaucratic system which recruited its personnel through civil service examinations. Textbooks for this examination were printed in vast numbers under the sponsorship of the imperial state. From the 16th century, the number of examination candidates went up and that increased the volume of print. By the 17th century, as urban culture bloomed in China, the uses of print diversified. Print was no longer used just by scholar officials. Merchants used print in their everyday life as they collected trade information. Reading increasingly became a leisure activity. The new readership preferred fictional narratives, poetry, autobiographies, anthologies of literary masterpieces, and romantic plays. These women began to read, and many women began publishing their poetry and plays. Wives of scholar officials published their works, and courtesans wrote about their lives. This new reading culture was accompanied by a new technology. Western printing technique and mechanical presses were imported in the late 19th century as Western powers established their outposts in China. Shanghai became the hub of the new print culture, catering to the Western style schools. From hand printing, there was now a gradual shift to mechanical print. Print in Japan. Buddhist missionaries from China introduced hand printing technology into Japan around AD 768 to 770. The oldest Japanese book printed in AD 868 is the Buddhist Diamond Sutra, containing 6 sheets of text and woodcut illustration. Pictures were printed on textiles. Playing cards and paper money. In medieval Japan, poets and prose writers were regularly published and books were cheap and abundant. Printing of visual material led to interesting publishing practices. In the late 18th century, in the flourishing urban circles at Edo, later known as Tokyo, illustrated collection of paintings depicted an elegant urban culture involving artists, courtesans, and tea house gatherings. Libraries and bookstores were packed with hand-printed material of various types. Books on omen, musical instruments, calculations, tea ceremony, flower arrangements, proper etiquette, cooking, and famous places. Belonging to the mid 13th century, printing wood blocks of Triptycha Koreana and are a Korean collection of Buddhist scriptures. They were engraved on about 80,000 wood blocks. They were inscribed on the UNESCO Memory of the World Register in 2007. Kitagawa Utamaro, born in Edo in 1753, was widely known for his contributions to an art form called ukiyo, pictures of the floating world, or depiction of ordinary human experiences, especially urban ones. These prints traveled to contemporary US and Europe and influenced artists like Manet, Monet, and Van Gogh. Publishers like Suya Zuzaburo identified subjects and commissioned artists who drew the theme in outline. Then a skilled woodblock carver pasted the drawing on a wood block and carved a printing block to reproduce the painter's lines. In the process, the original drawing would be destroyed and only prints would survive. Print comes to Europe. For centuries, silk and spices from China flowed into Europe through the Silk Route, the production of manuscripts carefully written by scribes. Then in 1295, Marco Polo, a great explorer, returned to Italy after many years of exploration in China. As he read above, China already had the technology of woodblock painting. Marco Polo brought this knowledge back with him. Now Italians began producing books and woodblocks, and soon the technology spread to other parts of Europe. Luxury editions were still handwritten on very expensive vellum meant for aristocratic circles, and rich monastic libraries which scoffed at printed books as cheap vulgarity. Merchants and students in the university towns bought the cheaper printed copies. Vellum, a parchment made from the skin of animals. The Jigji of Korea is among the world's oldest existing books printed with movable metal type. It contains the essential features of Zen Buddhism. About 150 monks of India, China, and Korea are mentioned in the book. It was printed in the late 14th century. While the first volume of the book is unavailable, the second one is available in the National Library of France. This work marked an important technical change in the print culture. That is why it was inscribed on the UNESCO Memory of the World Register in 2001. As the demand for books increased, booksellers all over Europe began exporting books to many different countries. Book fairs were held at different places. Production of handwritten manuscripts was also organized in new ways to meet the expanded demand. Scribes or skilled handwriters were no longer solely employed by wealthy or influential patrons, but increasingly by booksellers as well. More than 50 scribes often worked for one bookseller. But the production of handwritten manuscripts could not satisfy the ever increasing demand for books. Copying was an expensive, laborious, and time consuming business. Manuscripts were fragile, awkward to handle, and could not be carried around or read easily. Their circulation therefore remained limited. With the growing demand for books, woodblock printing gradually became more and more popular. By the early 15th century, woodblocks were being widely used in Europe to print textiles, playing cards, and religious pictures with simple brief text. There was clearly a great need for even quicker and cheaper reproduction of text. This could only be with the invention of a new print technology. The breakthrough occurred at Strasbourg, Germany, where John and Gutenberg developed the first known printing press in the 1430s. Gutenberg and the printing press. Gutenberg was the son of a merchant and grew up on a large agricultural estate. From his childhood, he had seen wine and olive presses. Subsequently, he learned the art of polishing stones, became a master goldsmith, and also acquired the expertise to create lead molds used for making trinkets. Drawing on this knowledge, Gutenberg adapted existing technology to design his innovation. The olive press provided the model for the printing press, and molds were used for casting the metal types for the letters of the alphabet. By 1448, Gutenberg perfected the system. The first book he printed was the Bible. About 180 copies were printed, and it took 3 years to produce them. By the standards of the time, this was fast production. The new technology did not entirely displace the existing art of producing books by hand. In fact, printed books at first closely resembled the written manuscripts in appearance and layout. The metal letters imitated the ornamental handwritten styles. Borders were illuminated by hand with foliage and other patterns, and illustrations were painted. In the books printed for the rich, space for decoration was kept blank on the printed page. Each purchaser could choose the design and decide on the painting school that would do the illustrations. In the 100 years between 1415 and 1550, printing presses were set up in most countries of Europe. Printers from Germany traveled to other countries seeking work and helping start new presses. As the number of printing presses grew, book production boomed. The second half of the 15th century saw 20 million copies of printed books flooding the markets in Europe. The number went up in the 16th century to about 200 million copies. This shift from hand printing to mechanical printing led to the print revolution. Platen in letterpress printing, platen is a board which is pressed onto the back of the paper to get the impression from the type. At one time it used to be a wooden board, later it was made of steel. Compositor, the person who composes the text for printing. Galley, metal frame in which types are laid and the text composed. The print revolution and its impact. What was the print revolution? It was not just a development, a new way of producing books. It transformed the lives of people, changing their relationship to information and knowledge, and with institutions and authorities. It influenced popular perceptions and opened up new ways of looking at things. Let us explore some of these changes. A new reading public. With the printing press, a new reading public emerged. Printing reduced the cost of books. The time and labor required to produce each book came down, and multiple copies could be produced with greater ease. Books flooded the market, reaching out to an ever-growing readership. Access to books created a new culture of reading. Earlier, reading was restricted to the elites. Common people lived in a world of oral culture. They heard sacred texts read out, ballads recited, and folk tales narrated. Ballad, a historical account or folk tale in verse, usually sung or recited. Knowledge was transferred orally. People collectively heard a story or saw a performance. As we will see in chapter 8, they did not read a book individually and silently. Before the age of print, books were not only expensive but they could not be produced in sufficient numbers. Now, books could reach out to wider sections of people. If earlier there was a hearing public, now a reading public came into being. But the transition was not so simple. Books could not be read only by the literate, and the rates of literacy in most European countries were very low till the 20th century. How then could publishers persuade the common people to welcome the printed books? To do this, they had to keep in mind the wider reach of the printed work. Even those who did not read could certainly enjoy listening to books being read out. So, printers began publishing popular ballads and folk tales, and such books would be profusely illustrated with pictures. These were then sung and recited at gatherings in villages and in taverns in towns. Taverns, places where people gathered to drink alcohol, to be served food, and to meet friends and exchange news. Oral culture thus entered print, and printed material was orally transmitted. The line that separated the oral and reading cultures became blurred, and the hearing public and reading public became intermingled. Religious debates and the fear of print. Print created the possibility of wide circulation of ideas and introduced a new world of debate and discussion. Even those who disagreed with established authorities could now print and circulate their ideas. Through the printed message, they could persuade people to think differently and move them to action. This had significance in different spheres of life. Not everyone welcomed the printed book, and those who did not also had fears about it. Many were apprehensive of the effects that the easier access to printed word and the wider circulation of books could have on people's minds. It was feared that if there was no control over what was printed and read, then rebellious and irreligious thoughts might spread. If that happened, the authority of valuable literature would be destroyed, expressed by religious authorities and monarchs, as well as many writers and artists. This anxiety was the basis of widespread criticism of the new printed literature that had begun to circulate. Let us consider the implication of this in one sphere of life in early modern Europe, namely religion. In 1517, the religious reformer Martin Luther wrote 95 theses criticizing many of the practices and rituals of the Roman Catholic Church. A printed copy of this was posted on a church door in Wittenberg. It challenged the church to debate his ideas. Luther's writings were immediately reproduced in vast numbers and read widely. This led to a division with the church and to the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation, a 16th century movement to reform the Catholic Church dominated by Rome. Martin Luther was one of the main Protestant reformers. Several traditions of anti-Catholic Christianity developed out of the movement. Luther's translation of the New Testament sold 5,000 copies within a few weeks, and a second edition appeared within 3 months. Deeply grateful to print, Luther said, "Printing is the ultimate gift of God and the greatest one." Several scholars, in fact, think that print brought about a new intellectual atmosphere and helped spread the new ideas that led to the Reformation. Print and dissent. Print and popular religious literature stimulated many distinctive individual interpretations of faith, even among little educated working people. In the 16th century, Manuzio, a miller in Italy, began to read books that were available in his locality. He reinterpreted the message of the Bible and formulated a view of God and creation that embraced the Roman Catholic Church. When the Roman Church began its inquisition to repress heretical ideas, Manuzio was hauled up twice and ultimately executed. Inquisition, a former Roman Catholic code for identifying and punishing heretics. Heretical beliefs which do not follow the accepted teachings of the Church. In medieval times, heresy was seen as a threat to the right of the Church to decide on what should be believed and what should not. Heretical beliefs were severely punished. The Roman Church, troubled by the such effects of popular readings and questionings of faith, imposed several controls over publishers and booksellers and began to maintain an index of prohibited books from 1558. Fear of the book. Erasmus, a Latin scholar and a Catholic reformer who criticized the excesses of Catholicism but kept his distance from Luther, expressed a deep anxiety about printing. He wrote in Edges, to what corner of the world do they not fly? These swarms of new books. It may be that one here and there contributes something worth knowing, but the very multitude of them is hurtful to scholarship because it creates a glut, and even in good things, satiety is most harmful. Printers fill the world with books, not just trifling things such as I write, perhaps, but stupid, ignorant, slanderous, scandalous, raving, irreligious, and seditious books, and the number of them is such that even the valuable publications lose their value. Satiety, the state of being fulfilled, must be on the point of satisfaction. Seditious action, speech, or writing that is seen as opposing the government. The reading mania. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, literacy rates went up in most parts of Europe. Churches of different denominations set up schools in villages carrying literacy to peasants and artisans. Denominations, subgroups within a religion. By the end by the end of the 18th century, in some parts of Europe, literacy rates were as high as 60 to 80%. As literacy in schools spread in European countries, there was a virtual reading mania. People wanted books to read, and printers produced books in ever increasing numbers. New forms of popular literature appeared in print, targeting new audiences. Booksellers employed peddlers who roamed around villages carrying little books for sale. There were almanacs or ritual calendars along with ballads and folktales. Almanac, an annual publication giving astronomical data, information about the movement of the sun and moon, timing of full tides and eclipses, and much else that was of importance in the everyday life of people. But other forms of reading matter, largely for entertainment, began to reach ordinary readers as well. In England, penny chap books were carried by petty peddlers, known as chapmen, and sold for a penny so that even the poor could buy them. Chapbook, a term used to describe pocket-sized books that are sold by traveling peddlers called chapmen. This became popular from the time of the 16th century print revolution. In France, where the Bibliothèque Bleue which were low priced small books printed on poor quality paper and bound in cheap blue covers. Then there were the romances printed on 4 to 6 pages and the more substantial histories which were stories about the past. Books were of various sizes serving many different purposes and interests. The periodical press developed from the early 18th century, combining information about current affairs with entertainment. Newspapers and journals carried information about wars and trade, as well as news of developments in other places. Similarly, the ideas of scientists and philosophers now became more accessible to the common people. Ancient and medieval scientific texts were compiled and published, and maps and scientific diagrams were widely printed. When scientists like Isaac Newton began to publish their discoveries, they could influence a much wider circle of scientifically minded readers. The writings of thinkers such as Thomas Paine, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau were also widely printed and read. Thus, their ideas about science, reason, and rationality found their way into popular literature. In 1791, a London publisher, James Leckington, wrote in his diary, "The sale of books in general has increased prodigiously within the last 20 years. the poorer sort of farmers and even the poor country people in general who before that period spent their winter evenings in relating stories of witches, ghosts, hobgoblins, now shorten the winter nights by hearing their sons and daughters read them tales, romances, etc. If John goes to town with a load of hay, he is charged to be sure not to forget to bring some peregrine pickles adventure. And when Dolly is sent to sell her eggs, she is commissioned to purchase the history of Joseph Andrews. Tremble, therefore, trends of the world. By the mid 18th century, there was a common conviction that books were means of spreading progress and enlightenment. Many believed that books could change the world, liberate society from despotism and tyranny, and heralded a time when reason and intellect would rule. Louis Sebastien Mercier, a novelist in 18th century France, declared, "The printing press is the most powerful engine of progress, and public opinion is the force that will sweep despotism away." In many of Mercer's novels, their heroes are transformed by acts of reading. They devour books, are lost in the world books create, and become enlightened in the process, convinced of the power of print in bringing enlightenment and restoring the basis of despotism. Mercier proclaimed, "Tremble, therefore, tyrants of the world, tremble before the virtual writer." Despotism is a system of governance in which absolute power is exercised by an individual, unregulated by legal and constitutional checks. This is how Mercier describes the impact of the printed works and the power of reading in one of his books. Anyone who had seen me reading would have compared me to a man dying of thirst who was gulping down some fresh pure water. Lighting my lamp with extraordinary caution, I threw myself hungrily into the reading. An easy eloquence, effortless and animated, carried me from one page to the next without my noticing it. A clock struck off the hours in the silence of the shadows, and I heard nothing. My lamp began to run out of oil and produce only a pale light, but still I read on. I could not even take out time to raise the wick for fear of interrupting my pleasure. How those new ideas rushed into my brain, how my intelligence adopted them. Print culture and the French Revolution. Many historians have argued that print culture created the conditions within which French Revolution occurred. Can we make such a connection? Three types of arguments have been usually put forward. First, print popularized the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers. Collectively, their writings provided a critical commentary on tradition, superstition, and despotism. They argued for the rule of reason rather than custom and demanded that everything to be judged through the application of reason and rationality. They attacked the sacred authority of the church and despotic power of the state, thus eroding the legitimacy of social order based on tradition. The writings of Voltaire and Rousseau were read widely, and those who read these books saw the world through new eyes that were questioning, critical, and rational. Second, print created a new culture of dialogue and debate. All values, norms, and institutions were re-evaluated and discussed by a public that had become aware of the power of reason and recognized the need to question existing ideas and beliefs. Within this public culture, new ideas of social evolution came into being. Third, by the 1780s, there was an outpouring of literature that mocked the royalty and criticized their morality. In the process, it raised questions about the existing social order. Cartoons and caricatures typically suggested that the monarchy remained absorbed only in sensual pleasures while the common people suffered immense hardships. This literature circulated underground and led to the growth of hostile sentiments against the monarchy. How do we look at these arguments? There can be no doubt that print helps the spread of ideas, but we must remember that people did not read just one kind of literature. If they read the ideas of Voltaire and Rousseau, they were also exposed to monarchical and church propaganda. They were not influenced directly by everything they read or saw. They accepted some ideas and rejected others. They, they interpreted things their own way. Print did not directly shape their minds, but it did open up the possibility of thinking differently. The 19th century. The 19th century saw vast leaps in mass literacy in Europe, bringing in large numbers of new readers among children, women, and workers. Children, women, and workers. As primary education became compulsory from the late 19th century, children became an important category of readers. Production of school textbooks became critical for the publishing industries. A children's press devoted to literature for children alone was set up in France in 1857. This press published new works as well as old fairy tales and folk tales. The Grimm brothers in Germany spent years compiling traditional folk tales gathered from peasants. What they collected was edited before the stories were published in a collection in 1812. Anything that was considered unsuitable for children or would appear vulgar to the elites was not included in the published version. Rural folk tales thus acquired a new form. In this way, print recorded old tales but also changed them. Women became important as readers as well as writers. Penny magazines were especially meant for women, as were manuals teaching proper behavior and housekeeping. When novels began to be written in the 19th century, women were seen as important readers. Some of the best known novelists were women: Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot. Their writings became important in defining a new type of woman, a person with will, strength of personality, determination, and the power to think. Lending libraries had been in existence from the 17th century onwards. In the 19th century, lending libraries in England became instruments for educating white collar workers, artisans, and lower middle class people. Sometimes self educated working class people wrote for themselves. After the working day was gradually shortened from the mid 19th century, workers had some time for self improvement and self expression. They wrote political tracts and autobiographies in large numbers. Thomas Wood, a Yorkshire mechanic, narrated how he would rent old newspapers and read them by firelight in the evenings as he could not afford candles. Autobiographies of poor people narrated their struggles to read against grim obstacles. The 20th century Russian revolutionary author Maxim Gorky's My Childhood and My University provide glimpses of such struggles. Further innovations. By the late 18th century, the press came to be made out of metal. Through the 19th century, there were a series of further innovation in printing technology. By the mid 19th century, Richard M. Howe of New York had perfected the power drive and cylindrical press. This was capable of printing 8,000 sheets per hour. This press was particularly useful for printing newspapers. In the late 19th century, the offset press was developed, which could print up to 6 colors at a time. From the turn of the 20th century, electrically operated presses accelerated printing operation. A series of other developments followed. Methods of feeding paper improved, the quality of plates became better, automatic paper reels and photoelectric controls of the color register were introduced. The accumulation of several individual mechanical improvements transformed the appearance of printed press text. Printers and publishers continuously developed new strategies to sell their product. 19th century periodicals serialized important novels, which gave birth to a particular way of writing novels. In the 1920s in England, popular works were sold in cheap series called the Shilling series. The dust cover or the book jacket is also a 20th century innovation. With the onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s, publishers feared a decline in book purchases. To sustain buying, they brought out cheap paperback editions. India and the world of print. Let us see when printing began in India and how ideas and information were written before the age of printing. Manuscripts before the age of printing. India had a very rich and old tradition of handwritten manuscripts in Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, as well as in various vernacular languages. Manuscripts were copied on palm leaves or on handmade paper. Pages were sometimes beautifully illustrated. They would be either pressed between wooden covers or sewn together to ensure preservation. Manuscript continued to be produced till well after the introduction of print down to the late 19th century. Manuscripts, however, were highly expensive and fragile. They had to be handled carefully and they could not be read easily as the script was written in different styles. So, manuscripts were not widely used in everyday life. Even though pre-colonial Bengal had developed an extensive network of village primary schools, students very often did not read text. They only learned to write. Teachers dictated portions of text from memory and students wrote them down. Many thus became literate without ever actually reading any kinds of text. Print comes to India. The printing press first came to Goa with Portuguese missionaries in the mid 16th century. Jesuit priests learned Konkani and printed several tracts. By 1674, about 50 books had been printed in the Konkani and in Kannada languages. Catholic priests printed the first Tamil book in 1579 at Cochin, and in 1713 the first Malayalam book was printed by them. The 1710 Dutch Protestant missionaries had printed 32 Tamil texts, many of them translations of older works. The English language press did not grow in India till quite late, even though the English East India Company began to import presses from the late 17th century. In 1780, James Augustus Hickey began to edit the Bengal Gazette, a weekly magazine that described itself as a commercial paper open to all but influenced by none. So it was private English enterprise, proud of its independence from colonial influence, that began English printing in India. Hickey published a lot of advertisements, including those that related to the import and sale of slaves, but he also published a lot of gossip about the company's senior officials in India. Enraged by this, Governor General Warren Hastings persecuted Hickey and encouraged the publication of officially sanctioned newspapers that could counter the flow of information that damaged the image of the colonial government. By the close of the 18th century, a number of newspapers and journals appeared in print. There were Indians too, who began to publish Indian newspapers. The first to appear was the weekly Bengal Gazette, brought out by Gangadhar Bhattacharya, who was close to Ram Mohan Roy. As late as 1768, a William Bolts affixed a notice on a public building in Kolkata. To the public, Mr. Bolts takes this method of informing the public that the want of a printing press in this city being of a great disadvantage in business, he is going to give the best encouragement to any persons who are versed in the business of printing. Bolt, however, left for England soon after and nothing came of the promise. Religious reform and public debates. From the early 19th century, as you know, there were intense debates around religious issues. Different groups confronted the changes happening within colonial society in different ways and offered a variety of new interpretations of the beliefs of different religions. Some criticized existing practices and campaigned for reform, while others countered the arguments of reformers. These debates were carried out in public and in print. Printed text and Newspapers not only spread the new ideas but they shaped the nature of the debate. A wider public could now participate in these public discussions and express their views. New ideas emerged through these clashes of opinions. This was a time of intense controversies between social and religious reformers and the Hindu orthodoxy over matters like widow immolation, monotheism, Brahminical priesthood, and idolatry. In Bengal, as the debate developed, tracts and newspapers proliferated, circulating a variety of arguments. To reach a wider audience, the ideas were printed in the everyday spoken language of ordinary people. Raman Roy published the Sambad Kaumudi in from 1821 and the Hindu Orthodoxy commissioned the Samachar Chandrika to oppose his opinions. From 1822, two Persian newspapers were published, Jam-e-Jahan Nama and Samsul Akbar. In the same year, a Gujarati newspaper, the Bombay Samachar, made its appearance. In North India, the ulama were deeply anxious about the collapse of Muslim dynasties. Ulama, legal scholars of Islam, and the Sharia, a body of Islamic law. They feared that colonial rulers would encourage conversion, change the Muslim personal laws. To counter this, they used cheap lithographic presses, published Persian and Urdu translations of holy scriptures, and printed religious newspapers and tracts. The Deoband Seminary, founded in 1867, published thousands upon thousands of fatwas telling Muslim readers how to conduct themselves in their everyday lives and explaining the meanings of Islamic doctrines. Fatwa, a legal pronouncement on Islamic law usually given by a mufti, legal scholar, to clarify issues on which the law is uncertain. All through the 19th century, a number of Muslim sects and seminaries appeared, each with a different interpretation of faith, each keen on enlarging its following and countering the influence of its opponents. Urdu print helped them conduct these battles in public. Among Hindus, too, print encouraged the reading of religious texts, especially in the vernacular languages. The first printed edition of the Ramcharitramanas of Tulsidas, a 16th century text, came out from Calcutta in 1810. By the mid 19th century, cheap lithographic editions flooded North Indian markets. From the 1880s, the Naval Kishori Press at Lucknow and the Sri Venkateswar Press in Bombay published numerous religious texts in vernaculars. In their printed and portable form, these could be read easily by the faithful at any place and time. They could also be read out to large groups of illiterate men and women. Religious texts therefore reached a very wide circle of people, encouraging discussion, debates, and controversies within and among different religions. Print did not only stimulate the publication of conflicting opinions amongst communities, but it also connected communities and people in different parts of India. Newspaper conveyed news from one place to another, creating pan-Indian identities. One newspaper, Krishnajit Trimbak Ranade, inhabitant of Pune, intends to publish a newspaper in the Marathi language with a view of affording useful information on every topic of local interest. It will be open for free discussion on subjects of general utility, scientific investigation, and the speculations connected with the antiquities, statistics, curiosities, history, and geography of the country and of the Deccan especially. The patronage and support of all interested in the diffusion of knowledge and welfare of the people is earnestly solicited. The task of the native newspapers and political association is identical to the role of the opposition in the House of Commons in Parliament in England, that is, of critically examining government policy to suggest improvements by removing those parts that will not be to the benefit of the people and also by ensuring speedy implementation. These associations ought to carefully study the particular issues, gather diverse relevant information on the nation as well as on What are the possible and desirable improvements, and this will surely earn it considerable influence. New forms of publication. Printing created an appetite for new kinds of writing. As more and more people could now read, they wanted to see their own lives, experiences, emotions, and relationships reflected in what they read. The novel, a literary form which had developed in Europe, ideally catered to this need. It soon acquired distinctively Indian forms and styles. For readers, it opened up new worlds of experience and gave a vivid sense of the diversity of human lives. Other new literary forms also entered the world of reading. Lyrics, short stories, essays about social and political matters. In different ways, they reinforced the new emphasis on human lives and intimate feelings about the political and social rules that shaped such things. By the end of the 19th century, a new visual culture was taking shape. With the setting up of an increasing number of printing presses, visual images could be easily reproduced in multiple copies. Painters like Raja Ravi Verma produced images for mass circulation. Poor wood engravers who made wood blocks set up shop near the letter presses and were employed by print shops. Cheap prints and calendars easily available in the bazaar could be bought even by the poor to decorate the walls of their homes or places of work. These prints began shaping popular ideas about modernity and tradition, religion and politics, and society and culture. By the 1870s, caricatures and cartoons were being published in journals and newspapers, commenting on social and political issues. Some caricatures ridiculed the educated Indians' fascinations with Western taste and clothes, while others expressed the fear of social change. They were imperial caricatures lampooning nationalists as well as nationalist cartoons criticizing imperial rules. Women and print. Lives and feelings of women began to be written in particularly vivid and intense ways. Women's reading therefore increased enormously in middle class homes. Liberal husbands and fathers began educating their women folk at home and sent them to schools when women's schools were set up in the cities and towns after the mid 19th century. Many journals began carrying writings by women and explained why women should be educated. They also carried a syllabus and attached suitable reading matter which could be used for home based schooling. But not all families were liberal. Conservative Hindus believed that a literate girl would be widowed, and Muslims feared that educated women would be corrupted by reading Urdu romances. Sometimes rebel women defied such prohibition. We know the story of a girl in a conservative Muslim family of North India who secretly learned to read and write in Urdu. Her family wanted her to read only the Arabic Quran, which she did not understand. So she insisted on learning to read a language that was her own. In East Bengal in the early 19th century, Rasundari Devi, a young married girl in a very orthodox household, learned to read in the secrecy of her kitchen. Later, she wrote her autobiography, Amar Ziban, which was published in 1876. It was the first full-length autobiography published in the Bengali language. Since social reforms and novels had already created great interest in women's life and emotions, there was also an interest in what women would have to say about their own lives. From the 1860s, a few Bengali women like Kailas Vasini Devi wrote books highlighting the experiences of women, about how women were imprisoned at home, kept in ignorance, forced to do hard domestic labor, and treated unjustly by the very people they served. In the 1880s, in present-day Maharashtra, Tarabai Sindhe and Pandita Ramabai wrote with passionate anger about the miserable lives of upper caste Hindu women, especially widows. A woman in Tamil novel expressed what reading meant to women who were so greatly confined by social regulation. For various reasons, my world is small. For more than half my life's happiness has come from books. In 1926, Begum Ruqayya Sakhawat Hossain, a noted educationist and literary figure, strongly condemned men for withholding education from women in the name of religion as she addressed the Bengal Women's Education Conference. The opponents of female education say that women will become unruly. Why? They call themselves Muslim and yet go against the basic tenet of Islam, which gives women an equal right to education. If men are not led astray once educated, why should women? When Urdu, Tamil, Bengali, and Marathi print culture had developed early, Hindi printing began seriously only from the 1870s. Soon, a large segment of it was devoted to the education of women. In the early 20th century, journals written for and sometimes edited by women became extremely popular. They discussed issues like women's education, widowhood, widows' remarriage, and the national movement. Some of them offered household and fashion lessons to women and brought entertainment through short stories and serialized novels. In Punjab, too, a similar folk literature was widely printed from the early 20th century. Ram Chadda published the first selling Istri Dharm Pichar to teach women how to be obedient wives. The Khalsa Tract Society published cheap booklets with a similar message. Many of these were in the form of dialogues about the qualities of a good woman. In Bengal, an entire area in central Calcutta, the Batla was devoted to the printing of popular books. Here you could buy cheap editions of religious texts and scriptures, as well as literature that was considered obscene and scandalous. By the late 19th century, a lot of these books were being profusely illustrated with woodcuts and colored lithographs. Peddlers took the Batla publications to homes, enabling women to read them in their leisure time. Print and the poor people. Very cheap small books were brought to markets in 19th century. Madras towns and sold at crossroads, allowing poor people traveling to markets to buy them. Public libraries were set up from the early 20th century, expanding the access to books. These libraries were located mostly in cities and towns, and aimed at times in prosperous villages. For rich local patrons, setting up a library was a way of acquiring prestige. From the late 19th century, issues of caste discrimination began to be written about in many printed tracts and essays. Jyotiba Phule, the Maratha pioneer of low caste protest movements, wrote about the injustices of the caste system in his Gulamgiri 1871. In the 20th century, B.R. Ambedkar in Maharashtra and E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar in Madras, better known as Periyar, wrote powerfully on caste, and their writings were read by people all over India. Local protest movements and sects also created a lot of popular journals and tracts. criticizing ancient scriptures and envisioning a new and just future. Workers in factories were too overcrowded and lacked the education to write much about their experiences. But Kasi, Kasi Baba, a Kanpur mill worker, wrote and published Chote aur Bade Ka Sawal in 1938 to show the links between caste and class exploitation. The poems of another Kanpur mill worker who were under the name of Sudarshan Chakra between 1935 and 1955 were brought together and published in a collection called Sachi Kavitaएं. By the 1930s, Bangalore cotton mill workers set up libraries to educate themselves, following the example of Bombay workers. These were sponsored by social reformers who tried to restrict excessive drinking among them, to bring literacy, and sometimes to propagate the message of nationalism. Print and censorship. Before 1798, the colonial state under the East India Company was not too concerned with censorship. Strangely, its early measures to control printed matter were directed against Englishmen in India who were critical of company misrule and hated the actions of particular company officers. The company was worried that such criticism might be used by critics in England to attack its trade monopoly in India. By the 1820s, the Calcutta Supreme Court passed certain regulations to control press freedom, and the company began encouraging publication of newspapers that would celebrate British rule. In 1835, faced with urgent petitions by editors of English and vernacular newspapers, Governor General Bentinck agreed to revise press laws. Thomas Macleay, a liberal colonial official, formulated new rules that restored the earlier freedoms. After the revolt of 1857, the attitude to freedom of the press changed. Enraged Englishmen demanded a clampdown on the native press. As vernacular newspapers became assertively nationalist, the colonial government began debating measures of stringent control. In 1878, the Vernacular Press Act was passed, modelled on the Irish press laws. It provided the government with extensive rights to censor reports and editorials in the vernacular press. From now on, the government kept regular track of the vernacular newspapers published in different provinces. When a report was judged as seditious, the newspaper was warned, and if the warning was ignored, the press was liable to be seized and the printing machinery confiscated. Despite repressive measures, nationalist newspapers grew in numbers in all parts of India. They reported on colonial misrule and encouraged nationalist activities. Attempts to throttle nationalist criticism provoked militant protest. This in turn led to a renewed cycle of persecution and protest. When Punjab revolutionaries were deported in 1907, Bal Gangadhar Tilak wrote with great sympathy about them in his Kesari. This led to his imprisonment in 1908, provoking in turn widespread protest all over India. Sometimes the government found it hard to find candidates for editorship of loyalist papers. When Sanders, editor of the Statements that had been founded in 1877, was approached, he asked rudely how much he would be paid for suffering the loss of freedom. The Friend of India refused a government subsidy, fearing that this would force it to be obedient to government commands. The power of the printed word is most often seen in the way governments seek to regulate and suppress print. The colonial government kept continuous track of all books and newspapers published in India and passed numerous laws to control the press. During the First World War, under the Defense of India rules, 22 newspapers had to furnish securities. Of these, 18 shut down rather than comply with government orders. The Sedition Committee report under Law Act in 1919 further strengthened controls that led to imposition of penalties on various newspapers. At the outbreak of the Second World War, the Defense of India Act was passed, allowing censoring of reports of war-related topics. All reports about the Quit India movement came under its purview. In August 1942, about 90 newspapers were suppressed. Gandhi said in 1922, liberty of speech, liberty of the press, freedom of association. The government of India is now seeking to crush the three powerful vehicles of expressing and cultivating public opinion. The fight for Swaraj, for Khilafat, means a fight for this threatened freedom before all else. तो ये है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज और इसी के साथ हमारा ये चैप्टर कंप्लीट होता है। तो अगर आप चैनल पर नए हैं तो चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और बेल आइकन पर क्लिक कर दीजिए ताकि आप डेली लाइव क्लास ज्वाइन कर सकें। साथ ही अगर आपको वीडियो अच्छा लगे तो लाइक कर दीजिए। तो हमारा ये सेशन यहीं तक था। थैंक यू, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।